Hi, welcome to this part of my Vampire the Masquerade 20th Anniversary Edition core book review. This time we're going to talk about character creation in Vampire the Masquerade. Character creation was somewhat of an innovation back in 1991 concerning the World of Darkness, because back then players were a bit more interested in creating a character that had spells and powerful attack values that could better help navigate a hostile environment. But because Vampire the Masquerade wanted to create a very deep persona to use in the game, it presented some innovations as a point-buy system. For example, other systems used numerical values. It felt quite crunchy at times, but in Vampire the Masquerade, in the character sheet, you recorded your different attributes, abilities, advantages using dots, so the system felt quite approachable. There were some things that felt approachable and also different from the norm, and this is because one of the designers of Shadowrun was involved in the Vampire the Masquerade project. So you really had the sense that they wanted you to play a game where character development and personal story and how that story meshed into the chronicle that you were telling had a priority. So when you started creating your vampire, you had to think of a concept. It was all about the character concept. After choosing your clan, you determined your nature and demeanor, and these 2 points were very useful to create a complex personality. It felt at times quite psychological, quite Jungian, I guess you could say, because you presented a persona aspect of yourself that would be like your demeanor, and the shadow self would be like the nature of your vampire. So for example, maybe your vampire could be present himself that he would have a demeanor of being bon vivant. So he was living the unlife in a shallow or meaningless way. He felt a bit too no worries, too whimsical. But maybe your nature was you were actually an architect. You had a greater sense of purpose, perhaps a really big plan for the jihad. So in this way, you could trick those around you. Usually, vampires in the same coterie, they were aware of how they were. They felt a bit like a vampiric family at times. But when interacting with other vampires in the setting, you usually pull the rug below other characters, other non-player characters' feet, by acting something that you were actually not. So maybe, for example, you acted as a deviant, but you are actually a guru, perhaps planning the downfall of an entire group. Or maybe you acted as a judge, constantly trying to improve the system, but maybe your nature was that of a monster. So you were a complete creature of darkness, acting with following no laws or principle. So you had many concepts such as martyr, loner, penitent, perfectionist, scientist, rebel. So you could play around with your nature and your demeanor, and you ended up creating a very complex character that strengthened the entire cohesion of the chronicles. When it comes to attributes, they are pretty self-explanatory. You basically had physical traits, that is strength, dexterity, and stamina. You had social traits, charisma, manipulation, and appearance. And you had mental traits, which are perception, intelligence, and wits. And these were here for you to affect the game world. Even though you could use your nature and demeanor, even more so in social situations. Attributes I basically consisted on focusing your character on perhaps on heavy lifting, on brawling, or investigation, or in performing really well in a social situation. So they felt a bit more mechanical, but they still added to the entire makeup or build of your character. Being a point buy system, you had to be really mindful on how you were distributing your points. And in this anniversary edition book, you even have rules to create more experienced vampires, because usually you create a neonate, but if you want to play as an elder vampire or even a Methuselah, you have the rules to create such a character. Although there is a supplement out there, if I'm not mistaken, that is more focused on playing as those ancient vampires. You also had to choose your abilities, which were talents, skills, and knowledges. So these abilities were added to your attributes in a success counting system. We will talk more about that in another part of this multi-part review. But you basically, for example, maybe you had a strength of 2 and you had some other ability or skill or talent that was 3, you would have 5 dice for a particular check. So these skills, these talents and knowledges also helped to better cover an area that other vampires in the group were not as specialized in. Because, for example, maybe your character was really good at athletics in a group that was more focused on investigation. So you have many things. On the side of talents, you have awareness, empathy, expression, intimidation, and such. And in skills, you had such things as animal ken, etiquette, firearms, larceny, stealth. And in knowledges, you had such things as academics, computer, investigation, law, medicine. So when creating a vampire, you were always checking to see what the other players were creating as well, because you didn't want an entire group focused on physical matters, I guess you could say, or intellectual matters. You wanted to balance things out, bring your own things because to the table, because you didn't know what types of situations you were going to encounter. And then you had advantages, that is disciplines, backgrounds, and virtues. There is a bit of a difference when you create a Sabbat character or a Camarilla character, or perhaps unaffiliated, because Sabbat characters are a bit more feral. It's not uncommon to see them quite powerful when it comes to disciplines and those supernatural powers that they can use, but they suffered a bit on their background because of that. Because, for example, a more civilized vampire in the Camarilla could have more contacts than someone in the Sabbat, but it depends. But usually the Sabbat used to forsake that and choose some more disciplines instead. And when it comes to virtues, virtues are basically something that allow you to keep yourself in check, not letting that beast, that monster within you, take control. So you had conscience, self-control, and courage. But if you were playing as a Sabbat type of character, conviction and instinct replaced conscience and self-control, because they are more about riding the beast rather than rejecting that beast or keeping it in check. The Sabbat vampire loves his inner beast. And then you had to determine some last touches, your humanity. Humanity is also a value that feels somewhat loose depending on the type of vampire that you are playing as. You have different paths, and we'll talk about those later on in another part. But basically, you have like a system of sins, but they differ dramatically depending on the path that you were choosing. So, for example, you're following the path of humanity, and every time you kill someone without necessity, your humanity would go down, and you would start to become more and more monstrous. But you were following, if you're following a path that is a bit more savage, more feral, like the path of the beast, if you avoid committing some act that has to do with your own survival or marking your ground, so to speak, that would be considered a sin. So you really ended up with some very complex characters, with all of that, the nature and demeanor and the skills and talents and the humanity and values, the virtues. There were some really complex characters that enriched the entire story. You also had willpower, and willpower is basically a way to save yourself from seemingly impossible to overcome odds. And you also had your blood pool. The younger that your vampire was, the less blood that you could have within you. So you usually wouldn't rely too much on disciplines. The younger vampires usually use a lot of technology and powerful weapons, firearms, etc. While older vampires, they have a fairly large blood pool and they can use disciplines and even empower their own physical attributes a bit more freely. Being a point-buy system, you also have freebie points to distribute and further flesh out the concept of your vampire. But there is also a system of flaws that could actually give you some freebie points to spend on the character build process. But you also had merits that were actually good things, positive things. But I will cover those merits and flaws later on in another part of this multi-part review, because it's almost at the end of the book, and right now I just wanted to give you like a framework of the character creation process. Another thing, when it comes to your character, you have health levels. And before, we're not going to get into combat yet, but this is a game that at times could actually become quite gritty. As you take damage, you get a dice pool penalty. So there's a point where you actually get mauled or even crippled, and you take a -2 or perhaps a -5 to your task resolutions, and it was like a downward spiral. So even though you are a vampire, if they attack you with some aggravated damage weapons or used fire and other supernatural means, you could end up dying quite quickly. You also have information on how to expend your experience points. You could use them to gain new traits, new disciplines, but in Vampire the Masquerade, you do not level up in a class. It has to make sense with the story. That is, if you belong to a certain clan, maybe you are from the Gangrel clan, you must have a very, very good reason as to why you would learn something related, for example, to Auspex, because it's simply not in the flavor of the Gangrel clan. It's more something that would you expect to find on the Toreador side of things. And there are some pretty cringy stories every now and then of players, power gamers, that basically took any discipline that they thought that would add to the vampire's power. So it made no sense. Suddenly you had Asimitsi learning thaumaturgy, but on the Tremere tradition, and it made almost no sense at all. So this character creation system of Vampire the Masquerade is really for mature players that have come into an agreement that they want to create an interesting story, and they're not going to focus on a single thing. Because, for example, Marco of Multiverso Distópico, remember to check out his channel. I'm going to put the link in the description below. He talked about how there were many horror situations, real RPG horror, where a lot of players were creating characters on the trench coat and katana side of things. They wanted to play as blades. Suddenly you have like a group of 3 or 4 blades and all of that drama and political intrigue and mysteries and wonder that you can experience in Vampire the Masquerade was lost because they were more focused on being the strongest vampire. So this is not a game focused on that type of gameplay. And anyone who in the Jihad who tries to become the strongest in such a, let's say, vulgar or overt way, ends up dead quite quickly. You just need a prince or a group of vampires planning the downfall of that specific vampire that does not know his place, and it's all over. So definitely a very rich character creation system in Vampire the Masquerade, and it's probably the greatest strength of Vampire the Masquerade, but also its greatest weakness if you do not talk things out with your players beforehand, so they do not create some boring character concepts. Well, thanks for watching this part of my multi-part review. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. See you later.